Good morning. Ani buju minogiship. Nibana mikanem bamose indigenas maingan dodem gnoshikaning and donjaba anishnabe and Dao. What I shared with you is a way that us Ojibwe people greet one another and greet people that we meet. Ani and buju both mean hello. One is more formal than the other. I said my name is Nibana Mikanem Bamose, which means he walks many paths. My grandmother gave me that name as an adult. Actually, she said because I travel so much for work. I am a Wolf Clan member, and I come from the place of the pike in the waters in our community, just off in a bay on Lake Superior. We have a lot of pike, which for those of you who aren't familiar, it's kind of like a freshwater barracuda. And I said Anishinaabe and Dao, which means I call myself Anishinaabe, which is the tribal people of Ojibwe or Chippewa, Odawa, and Potawatomi. We're all a big family. And I'm really glad to be here with all of you this morning. Today. I'm glad to be here in person with you. And it's awkward to be introduced as Mr. Newland because that was my grandpa. I come from a family of teachers, and my grandpa was the superintendent, the principal, and a teacher at our school for a long time. He was Mr. Newland, and he's been gone now for 20 years, but he's still Mr. Newland to so many people, so it's really weird to me to be called Mr. Newland. My grandmother, Mrs. Newland, was the band teacher, and I was compelled, voluntold that at a young age that I was going to be in band and music growing up. And I am married to my wife, Erica. We went to middle school and high school together, and her grandma was the elementary school teacher, their principal. And both of us have aunties and uncles who were teachers. And so I share that with you for two reasons. One is if it seems like a square, like I'm a square, that's true because I couldn't get away with nothing growing up with so many teachers at the school. But two, it's because I know what you do. I have great respect and appreciation for what you do. I'm the black sheep in my family as a lawyer. And I know how dedicated you all are. Very few people become teachers simply to earn a paycheck. Earning a paycheck that pays all of your bills and allows you to have some fun is important and something we should all support. But you guys are doing this because you believe in teaching, in education. And I also wanted to share that I'm very proud that my son, who's a sophomore at Michigan State University, is studying to be a teacher himself, carrying on the family tradition. And so I want to thank, or say miigwech, to Teaching for Change for inviting me here today, and for the National Museum of the American Indian for hosting us to have me here at the 7th Annual Indigenous Peoples Day Teach-In. Before becoming Assistant Secretary or serving as Assistant Secretary for Indian Affairs, I was elected 2 times as the president of the Bay Mills Indian Community. We're located as far north in Michigan almost as you can go. And to paraphrase a famous quote, I can see Canada from my house. We are one of many Ojibwe tribes in Michigan, or in the United States and Canada, and part of a family of tribal nations across Indian country who called this continent home for thousands and thousands of years, time immemorial. As tribal president, I had a lot of responsibilities, particularly through the early days of the COVID-19 pandemic, to work with my fellow tribal leaders in our community to protect our homelands, not only for our people today, but generations to come, and to protect the people who call those lands home. And what I learned from that experience has helped me in my job now where I talk almost daily with tribal leaders about issues facing their communities from the North Slope of Alaska all the way to the southern tip of Florida and everywhere in between. And I also bring my experience as a former adjunct professor and chair of the Board of Regents of the Bay Mills Community College to this job. Again, so in this role, I oversee the Bureau of Indian Education, which operates more than 180 schools across 27 states with 45,000 students. So a lot of that experience at the tribe was really relevant to what I'm doing now. Together, the Bureau of Indian Education and the Bureau of Indian Affairs and the Bureau of Trust Funds Administration make up the Indian Affairs bureaus at the Department of the Interior. And our mission is to provide direct services and funding to 574 federally recognized tribes across the country so that programs and schools can serve their people in their communities. And at Indian Affairs, we support and we are the leading agency for the federal government in maintaining our nation-to-nation relationship with sovereign tribes in the United States and upholding what we call the federal trust responsibility to all Indian people, which means protecting the right of Indian people to exist as Indian people. And this work includes acknowledging our past and working to undo the harms that were caused by federal policies that were intended to harm Indian tribes and Indian people. And I want to encourage all of you to be honest with your students, with each other, and acknowledge that the relationship between tribes and the federal government hasn't always been good. Colonization has left a lot of painful scars and wounds, not only on Indian people, but on this nation that are still present. And we still have work to do to heal from these wounds. So by being honest about the past, we can lay the groundwork for that healing and for respecting and empowering our youth. Specifically, today, I want to talk to you about the troubled legacy of federal Indian boarding schools in this country and our efforts today to shed light on that history. I serve under Secretary of the Interior Deb Haaland, who is the first American Indian person in the history of the United States. Yes. The first American Indian person in the history of this country to serve in a presidential cabinet. And she is every bit as wonderful a boss as you would expect based on how you see her in public, and just an amazing person. And under her leadership, we've taken on this Federal Indian Boarding School Initiative, which is, for the first time in the history of this country, a comprehensive review of the federal Indian boarding school system. Last year, we released the first volume of the Federal Indian Boarding School Initiative investigative report. And that report, which you can find online, explains the policy behind the federal Indian boarding schools system, and it details the initial findings, including an official list, the first official list in this country's history, of all of the federal Indian boarding schools and a map of where they're located. And our report confirms that the federal Indian boarding school system was part of a twin United States federal government policy: the forced assimilation of Indian people through children to facilitate the taking of Indian lands. They're connected. And our report explains that the federal government pursued its policy of forced assimilation by targeting Indian children. And the federal Indian boarding schools were the primary means to carry out this policy. So in the early days of the United States, all the way back almost to the founding, there was this belief that if we, the federal government, could change Indian people, forcibly assimilate them, that they wouldn't have this indigenous connection with their lands. They wouldn't need so much land. And if they don't need all this land, then it's available for the rest of us. And as those of us in middle age and beyond can attest, it's really hard to teach adults new things and to act differently. So they quickly discovered that the best way to do this was to target Indian children. It was a deliberate choice, a deliberate policy to aim at Indian children for forced assimilation. And our report shows that all three branches of the federal government had a role to play in this boarding school policy. Multiple generations of Indigenous children were forced by the United States federal government to go through this system. And based on their political and legal status as Indian people and Native Hawaiians, the United States government, under its constitutional authorities, had recognized legal power to do this. So before starting our work, we first engaged and consulted with tribes to make sure that we were incorporating Indian country's views into our work. We wanted to make sure that this was not just another federal policy, federal initiative done to Indian people, but instead done with Indian people. So through our Bureau of Trust Funds Administration, we decided to focus our work on federal records and to examine those records to develop this official list of federal Indian boarding schools and to start our work of identifying marked and unmarked burial sites. And just a note on that, having grown up near Canada and lived my whole life as an Indian person, I've heard people sometimes say, why do we need to focus on this and why do we need to talk about these boarding schools? What's the big deal? And I heard somebody once poignantly say, how many kids are buried outside the school you attended? Because so many of these boarding schools had burial sites and cemeteries, many of them unmarked. And so we searched our records to start identifying those burial sites. Most of our records in the federal government for Indian affairs are stored in an underground cave in Lenexa, Kansas. This was actually a state-of-the-art facility that was developed because the federal government was so bad at taking care of records for Indian people that it led to a landmark multi-billion-dollar legal settlement with tribes more than a decade ago. Some of these records go back all the way to the 1700s, and they're so fragile that they can't be handled by your hands. And those were some of the records we looked at in this research. And for Volume 1, our first report, our team reviewed more than 98 million pages of documents. So the department entered into an agreement with the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition to share information and records that contributed to our report. And so as it currently stands, our report shows that between 1819 and 1969, the United States operated directly or supported 408 Indian boarding schools in 37 states, including 21 schools in Alaska and 7 schools in Hawaii. Our report, as I mentioned, identifies each school by name and location, and some of these schools operated in multiple sites. While generations of Indian and Native Hawaiian children entered these boarding schools, many children died there, often hundreds or thousands of miles away from their homelands and from their families. Many other children died trying to run away from these schools and were unaccounted for. In our first report, we've identified 53 marked or unmarked burial sites for Indian children across this system. And as we move toward another report on this, we are going to lay out many more burial sites that we've accounted for in our research. Our initial investigation shows that approximately 50% of federal Indian boarding schools receive support or involvement from a religious organization, including funding, infrastructure, and staffing and personnel. And the federal government at times actually paid religious institutions on a per capita basis for Indian children to go to these schools that those institutions operated. Our investigation also shows that the United States actually used money from federal Indian trust accounts to pay for Indian children to attend these schools. So let me just explain this a little further. When the federal government would enter treaties with tribes, would often pay for the land that it was acquiring, a nominal sum or a small sum, and then it would hold land in trust for both tribes and individual people. And so if a farmer was going to, or a rancher was going to use somebody's lands, they were required to pay the federal government royalties that would then go back to the Indian landowner. And a lot of times what happened with these boarding schools, the federal government would say, if you don't send your kids to the boarding schools, you will go to jail. Many people were taken to jail for this. There's a famous, infamous incident where a number of Hopi men from the Hopi Reservation in Arizona refused to send their kids to boarding school, so they were actually taken and held at Alcatraz in the early 1900s. And so with these, the federal government would say, if you don't send your kids to boarding school, we're going to send you to jail, and we're going to withhold your trust funds, the rent for the other people who are using your land. And so people, they under that threat of coercion would send their kids to boarding school, and then the federal government would take those trust funds and pay for the expense to do that. Our report also describes the conditions that Indian students and Native Hawaiian children experience in this system. Those conditions included militarized identity alteration methodologies. So deprogramming. We cut your hair, we change your name, we forbid you from speaking your language. We drill you in the morning, you get up and you march like soldiers. All these things that we do in the military to reprogram people for discipline and uniformity. And this was done to children as a way to forcibly assimilate them. And our federal records also affirm that the federal Indian boarding school system, as I just mentioned, prevented children from speaking their languages and often focused on vocational training instead of education involving manual labor of Indian children like lumbering, bricklaying, and constructing railroads. In fact, as we move forward in time into the 1900s and in the mid-century, a lot of the kids who went to these schools were made available to wealthy people surrounding the schools as domestic laborers. And they would call this an outing program and say, we're giving you worker experience. So we weren't using these schools to educate Indian people. It was, it was skills training to ensure, in part, that Indian people would be in the worker class and made available and outsourced. And as we've heard throughout our work, a lot of abuse occurred during that outing system where you're putting young Indian girls into people's homes without adult supervision to be a domestic laborer. We also found throughout our research in reviewing what's called the Running Bear studies, which looked at now adult federal Indian boarding school attendees' medical status, that the Indian boarding school system continues to impact people today who went to these boarding schools and their families. And these studies show that we have a need to examine and report by an independent research group to assess the current impacts the boarding school has on Indigenous people living today, including their health, education, and economic status. As part of this initiative, we didn't just do this research and draft a report. Secretary Haaland and I also have been traveling around the United States, participating in listening sessions called the Road to Healing Tour, where we hear directly from boarding school survivors and their family members about their experiences. And this has been some of the most meaningful work I've ever done in my life, and also some of the hardest. To sit in a large gymnasium often, or a large venue, and hear people, oftentimes elders, stand up and talk about the worst thing that's ever been done to them. And a lot of these folks who have stood up to speak, many of them are sharing it for the first time. And I want to share just one example about why it's relevant today. Oftentimes you as teachers in this environment, it's really hard to teach about history. People say, why do you want to dredge up these awful things from the past? What does it even matter today? We were at one listening session in South Dakota for the secretary and I to hear from these boarding school survivors. And this woman got up to speak. She was about my age. And she said, my whole life I had a bad relationship with my mom. I always thought she was mean. I could never understand why she was the way that she was. And then this woman said that she worked in an urban Indian health center out west, and that one day a letter came in the mail, and it happened to come to her, and she opened it, and in this letter this woman was writing saying, I've been trying to find my friend from boarding school. She helped me get through boarding school. And I heard that she may be living in the city that your center serves, and I'd really like help connecting with her, and it included a photo from when they were in boarding school. And that woman said that she looked at the photo and it was her mom. And she had never known that her mom had attended an Indian boarding school, and her mom had never talked about it. And then after she finished speaking, her mom stood up, she was with her, and for the first time since she had left boarding school, talked about her experience. And so you can see why this history isn't just history. It affects people's relationships today. There's a reason I'm speaking English to you this morning, right? Sometimes people will say, we lost our language, we lost our ability to speak our language. And I had, at one of these sessions, an elder stood up and spoke. He said, I didn't lose my language. I wasn't walking along and it fell out of my pocket. He said, it was taken from us. He said, our language was taken from us. Our connections with our families were taken from us. And we all know, regardless of whether you're Indian or white or what background you come from, that people who suffer trauma carry that trauma with them. And that if it's unhealed, people re-experience that in the way that our minds work. That trauma, it's not put in our past, right? Every time you are triggered or re-experiencing that, it's like it's happening today. And so of course that's going to affect your ability to be well today, to hold down a job, right? To have a good relationship with your family. And so these boarding schools impact people today. We have unhealed trauma from our past that carries forward through, as these studies have shown, it impacts the children and the descendants of people who went to these schools. So we're working now on a second volume of our investigative report, which we are aiming to finish this year. And the focus of that report is going to include trying to identify the number of Indian children who went to these schools. You saw in the video at the start today, Canada has embarked on this journey in the past, and they've been able to identify a lot of facts about their residential boarding school system. So we're going to try to put a number on how many children went to these schools. We're also going to try to identify and locate the grave sites. Both the marked and unmarked grave sites. And this is enormously challenging because a lot of these boarding school sites are not on present-day federal lands. Many of them have, over the decades and centuries, gone into private ownership now. And a lot of people don't even, because many of them were unmarked, a lot of people don't even know that there are grave sites there. So we're going to do our best to try to detail how many burial sites there were across the system. And we're also going to try to lay out how much money the United States federal government spent on these schools, how much money the United States invested in forcible assimilation, and put a present-day value on that amount. And just this past week, as the third component of the boarding school initiative, we announced, in partnership with the Boarding School Healing Coalition, that we are embarking on what's called the Oral History Project, where we are going to take interview testimony from hundreds of people who attended these boarding schools, most of whom now are elders, and record that for our record here in the United States. And then at some point work to make those stories available to the American people so that people have a firsthand account of what happened. We know now that just in the past 2 years that this work is having a positive impact. It's really shed a light on this era. It's now made its way into the consciousness of many people. A lot of people are at least aware about it. We're hearing and seeing references to it in popular culture. A number of TV shows have already referenced boarding schools here in the United States. Many of you may have seen some of these shows. We've also seen the positive impact in the law. Just last fall, I, along with others from our office, attended the oral arguments at the United States Supreme Court over the Indian Child Welfare Act case. People were challenging whether the federal government could pass a law to protect Indian children from being taken away from their homes and families. And in that Supreme Court oral argument, many of the justices from across the spectrum, the political spectrum on the court, were asking questions about boarding schools and the federal government's history of running these schools and the legal authority that the federal government relied upon to operate these schools targeting Indian children. And we saw earlier this year in an overwhelming and resounding decision that the United States Supreme Court, this United States Supreme Court, upheld the Indian Child Welfare Act, and in the process of doing that, cited our federal Indian boarding school report many times. And we're really proud of that. Thank you. So I mentioned earlier, kind of a bummer topic, right, on Saturday morning, that the historic policies of dispossession of lands and forced assimilation of Indian people, and that these policies have had a lasting impact on Indian people. There's not a single American Indian in the United States whose lives were not impacted by these boarding schools. I have 2 people in my family, great-grandparents, who attended these boarding schools, and almost every Indian person does. But the legacy of harm and the breakup of Indian families has touched every single American Indian person in the United States. And that's why it's important that our work also involves ensuring that tribal children, young people and adults have a chance now at building better futures for themselves and their tribal nations. And that means doing what we can today to improve education and public safety, to revitalize tribal languages and cultures, to protect tribal homelands, and to increase economic opportunity for people living in tribal communities. And as I think everybody in here and those of you watching online know by now, tribal languages are vital to Indigenous culture because it carries information within it that explains our connections to one another. It carries information about our past and meaning from previous generations that just don't overlap perfectly with English. It's central to being an Indigenous person. And the knowledge that's carried forward through tribal languages was acquired over thousands of years. You have to remember that most tribal people didn't have written languages in history books. So the languages that Indian people spoke were designed to be shared and contain information within the words, within the sentences, carried forward to carry that information. That's the historical record from an Indigenous perspective. And so today, because as a direct result of these boarding schools, many tribes are at risk of losing their languages forever or having had them taken. And that's a direct consequence of these boarding schools. So I mentioned our trust responsibility earlier is to protect the existence of Indian people as Indian people. Exercising the federal trust responsibility to protect Indian people doesn't just mean stop doing bad stuff, right? All right, now we're good. We've stopped the bad stuff. We've stopped the colonization. We're not doing that anymore. The trust responsibility also means revitalizing what we tore down, rebuilding what we tore down. That means partnering with tribes, working together with Indian people as trustee to revitalize tribal languages, to work with tribal communities to help protect and revitalize their cultural lifeways. There are countless examples, but many tribes in Alaska, for example, continue to live off the land today in subsistence. And our job as a trust responsibility isn't just to stop doing harm to that, it's to ensure that they can continue that way of life for generations to come. So as part of our trust responsibility to tribes, we've committed ourselves to tribal language revitalization. Accidentally hit a button. And that includes a 10-year national plan on national or native language revitalization. And this plan lays out a long-term all-of-government strategy for the revitalization, protection, and preservation of native languages. And as we develop this plan, we're considering how native language revitalization can be integrated into the rest of American society and culture through things like signage in communities, inclusion in school curricula outside of tribal communities, and many more. These are just some of the examples of the work that we're doing with tribal communities to help protect and revitalize their cultural lifeways and their languages. So when it comes to education sovereignty, much of our work is in the tribally controlled school system through the Bureau of Indian Education. Our work at the Department of the Interior allows for schools that tribes run themselves. They exercise their sovereign governmental powers to operate these schools and ensure that they're respectful of and revitalizing their cultures and languages and laying the foundation for a lot of the work that I just described. And we work in partnership with tribal nations in this effort. This isn't the old days where we go in and tell tribes, you must do it the way we said because we know what's best for you. We now have a federal policy of self-determination, which is really come about in many of our lifetimes. If you think of the history of our country, we're now in this new policy era where we say, we're not going to tell you, Indian people, what's best for you. We're going to support you making these decisions for yourself in a partnership. And that's what we aim to do through our Bureau of Indian Education schools. They're not the boarding schools of the past. And educating Indigenous students is a critical component of tribal sovereignty. We want our students to leave the classroom and return to their communities as intellectual assets to their people, to our people, ready to rebuild and revitalize and move their communities forward. And this guiding principle now is a direct response to our legacy of colonization, which sought to take away all of these things. Our work is rooted in this principle that every Native person has the right to live safe, healthy, and fulfilling lives in their homeland as a Native person. So we've shifted away from a policy of forced assimilation and are now in this era of termination. And at the department, we're working to ensure that Indigenous ways of knowing, Indigenous ways of praying, Indigenous ways of speaking are protected and revitalized. And we're incorporating Indigenous knowledge into the science that informs our decision making. And a word on that is a lot of people view these things as in conflict with one another. There's science, and then there's religion and hokum and all these other things. But as I explained earlier, our tribal languages are the record of our history. They're the record of the things that we've learned over time. And I often like to talk about, you hear this phrase, traditional ecological knowledge or indigenous knowledge. It's just science done by Indians, right? It's observing something, seeing that it's true, testing it, retesting it, and saying, okay, this thing is true, so we're going to incorporate it into our language and pass it down in these teachings that you'll be able to carry forward in speech instead of in text. It's just science. And so we're working to incorporate that into our science work at the Department of the Interior, which has a lot of scientific agencies included within it, so that when a tribe tells you, we know that this fish is supposed to live in this river, and we know what this river is supposed to look like, we don't have to get a whole bunch of people from out here on the East Coast to fly in there and study for years and years with PhDs to say, oh yeah, you guys were right all along. We're trying to lean on that knowledge because it's an asset. It's an asset for all of us as Americans. And so we're in this era now where we're not trying to take those things away. We're trying to build upon them and respect them. And in that effort, you all as teachers can make a difference by providing just basic respect for these principles, for Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous ways of knowing, and providing space for students to hear Native people telling their own stories. You can help build upon this work to revitalize Indigenous cultures and ways of knowing. Everybody in here, I imagine, and everybody listening to this has had an experience in your life where when you've told a story about something you lived through, something you saw, something you know, somebody says, that's not true, I don't believe you, right? How frustrating that is. When you have a lived experience that other people are denying you. You say, that's not true because I didn't see it, or I don't believe you, or I don't respect you enough to even listen to you. How maddening that is. It's humiliating, right? When someone tells you that what you know, what you've experienced, what you lived isn't true, it takes your dignity from you. And that is how this all ties into the work that you do as teachers, in providing space for your Native students, Native people in your communities, to affirm their lived experience, to affirm our lived experience, to affirm the things that we know to be true, is doing this work. And I know it's challenging for you, especially in many communities where people, they're ashamed of some of these things that I just talked about. They don't want to understand not only maybe they didn't play a role in it, but how they've benefited from that. And so they don't want to talk about it because it makes them uncomfortable. And they don't want to provide these spaces to affirm the lived experience of every American. And that's where you guys come in. And I'm so grateful that you're all here today, that you're all engaged in this work and supporting the revitalization of Indigenous cultures and languages, not only today, but for generations to come. So I want to say miigwech. Thank you all very much for your time today and for the work that you do.